Hello everybody, this is Jacob Lawler back again with another edition of Handling a Buyer Escrow, this time step 4 and part 4, the appraisal, loan approval, and removing of contingencies. And before we get started in the content, just want to make sure that you are aware that this is a part in a series of training videos. So if you haven't already watched part 3, please click this button right here on the screen, or I'll also have links in the description down below for physical inspection and handling the request for repair, because that step definitely comes before what we're going to talk about today. And again, this is part 4 in a 5-part series. The first part we went over was the overview and the organization of the escrow. Step 2, video 2, was introductions and starting off on the right foot. Step 3 was physical inspection and the request for repairs. Today's video is on appraisal, loan approval, and the removal of contingencies. And next video is the final video in the series of closing escrow and handling those last-minute hiccups. And what we went over last video, just a quick recap, was the physical inspection, which we called the true test, because that is really when the agent and also the client starts to have the first dose of reality that they're actually buying a house. And remember, it was a 1.5 to 2 hours of finding out everything that was wrong with the property. So the steps to a successful inspection that we went over was to prepare them for what an inspection is like. And again, I gave you a free sample inspection of one of my own personal inspections back when I was in sales that you can use. And I've also blacked out their names just for security purposes and privacy. Make sure that the seller is not there at the property. Make sure that the buyer is there at the property so that they can hear directly from the inspector. We talked about how to order the inspection, how to gather all the disclosures and documents and the importance of that, conducting the inspection, making sure the inspector does an overview, and also how to handle those areas of concern. And we did talk about showing up early to let the inspector in, to conduct your AVID or agent visual inspection disclosure prior to your clients arriving, telling your clients to take measurements of their furniture to fall back in love with the house, to go over, sign all the disclosures, have the inspector give an overview, ask the inspector to kind of give an overall, is this an average, above average, or below average condition compared to those homes in the area. Handling those areas of concern when we do get those concerns. Just to remember, the physical inspector is a general home inspector. They tell you what areas you should have specialists comes out. Try not to have the clients to come up with make or break items. Remember that every home is sold in its present physical as is condition, and for the most part, they're buying a used house unless you're dealing with new home construction, and the seller is under no obligation to make any repairs. To write the actual successful request for repair, try not to make a laundry list of items. Don't do more than 5. Keep it down to the major items. Don't nitpick over open junction boxes or those small ticket items. My own personal recommendation, again, is to ask for closing cost credit rather than actual repairs. The only challenge with that is to make sure you check and identify how much total closing costs is required, and prepare your clients that the seller may not even respond to that request. And that was really the first hurdle for us to jump, which luckily we're past that point, so congratulations on jumping the first major hurdle. So let's get into the appraisal. And just so you know, the appraisal is an opinion of value. It is definitely not an objective black and white valuation of the property. It is subjective. It is an opinion of value, and you, number one, and also clients should understand that if you get 10 different appraisers out to the property, they will give 10 different valuations if they don't know what number they're supposed to quote unquote shoot for. So let's talk about steps of an appraisal. Number one, the lender will order the appraisal. The buyer will pay for it up front. Generally, the lender will ask the client to sign some form or give them a credit card number, and they will actually charge them right up front. But the lender is going to be the one who does order the appraisal. That appraiser will then call the listing agent, most likely, for access to the property to coordinate how can they actually get in. Very rarely do buyer's agents ever actually meet and or discuss or talk with the appraiser. but I would highly recommend asking that the listing agent tell you the date and time of the appraisal. That way you can know. Sometimes listing agents don't even let you know, and all of a sudden you hear, oh my goodness, we did the appraisal today, and you didn't have any idea about it. The reason why I always recommend to have the listing agent tell you the date and time, because you want to prepare an appraisal package. This is usually considered the burden of the listing agent, but a good buyer's agent always takes burden on themselves to make sure that their client's appraisal comes in, that their client's loan gets approved, to take responsibility on every step of the way. Things that I personally like to include in an appraisal package, obviously relevant sales. General rule of thumb is, not outside 1 mile radius and within 90 days of that property. So within 90 days of the sale and within 1 mile radius, but preferably you want to stay as close as possible, and also in the same tract or the same, depending upon which area you're working. Don't go outside of the city boundary, don't go outside of zip code boundary. Try to stay the most relevant sales possible. They're going to need at least 3 relevant sales, and there are different guidelines, and we can get as complicated as you want. There are entire courses devoted towards putting together comps for appraisers. But long story short, rule of thumb, within 1 mile radius as well as within 90 days of the last sale, and they need at least 3 in order to use them. Also, copy of the contract. I was surprised to know of how many appraisers don't actually know the value that they're quote-unquote shooting for. So I always like to include a copy of the contract so that the appraiser sees the value that we would like them to bring it in. And also I like to add a little letter of explanation. This is very optional, but I always like to kind of tell the story. There were multiple offers or something along those lines. And if you were the listing agent on transactions, for future reference, I would definitely recommend including copies or at least page 1 of all of the different offers that you've received. Like, let's say you got 10 offers on a property and it went over list price, and the appraiser's kind of, hemming and hawing about value. If you include the 10 offers in there to show the demand for the property, that may influence everything that's going on. But again, there's going to be no way to ever say that it's always going to go your way, no matter how much you prepare for it. And also, I do recommend as a buyer's agent, you do attend the appraisal. Number one, just so that you can start getting an idea of how appraisals work and all of that. But also, you want to give yourself every opportunity to improve the situation of an appraisal. So let's talk about some common hiccups of an appraisal, because they don't always go according to plan. One major thing fairly common is smoke detectors. Currently, as recording this video, the requirement is there needs to be one in every bedroom and adjacent hallway, but always check to see what your local ordinances do require. So making sure that the smoke detectors are in and are operable. Second thing, fairly common, carbon monoxide detectors. Currently, as of recording this, there needs to be one per level of the home, but again, check your local ordinances about what are required in your particular market, in your area, but making sure that there's a carbon monoxide detector in at least one each level of the home. Little tip, I always recommend having smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors in your car. That way, if you show up to the appraisal, another reason why to show up, and the appraiser says, oh, you know what, I'm missing a carbon monoxide, you can say, oh, you know what, I actually had that in my car, I was supposed to install that before. Have a plug-in version of the carbon monoxide, because that will definitely save you time and heartache. Second, water heater needs to be properly braced and strapped here in California. And also, there's something called a TPR discharge pipe, that when the water heater overheats and it lets out steam, there needs to be a pipe that reroutes that steam down towards the floor, and it's somewhere between, it needs to be, I believe it's 12 inches off of the floor. That way it doesn't spray you in the face. That's a very common thing. Also, if you're doing FHA or VA, overall property condition can be an issue, like no chipped or peeling paint, cracked windows, torn screens. Also, garage doors need to have an automatic closing mechanism on them, on the hinges. There's a whole list of items that need to be in place for FHA and VA, and that's a whole different presentation. And also, the scariest hiccup, the appraised value coming in low. Now, I'm going to tell you something that agents don't want to hear, and that's that appraisals oftentimes do come in low. There's no way about it, there's no way to fight it. Sometimes appraisers don't, they're, especially in an appreciating market, like at the time of this video being recorded, we are in an appreciating market currently. When you watch this video, I don't know what the market's going to be for you, but sometimes appraisals do come in low, and it's not a fun time. But let's actually talk about, yes, it is true, they do come in low, but let's talk about what to do if an appraisal does come in low. Number one, you can contest the appraisal. You can go back to the appraiser and say, hey, I don't agree with your valuation of the property. What they'll do is they'll actually give you will have a copy of the appraisal itself. Well, they will show what properties they compared that property to, as well as all of the adjustments that they made. And you can contest individual adjustments. You can contest the properties that they did. That is an involved process that does take time. So understand that if you're going to contest the appraisal, escrows will generally go longer than scheduled, just because you are contesting and trying to bring up the value. If, let's say, you go through that and that still doesn't work, the value still comes in low, you can try to negotiate with the seller. You can say, hey, Mr. Seller, the offer was at $500, the appraised value came in at $480. Can we drop the price down to $480? The seller may say no, but maybe we'll come down to $490 and we'll split the difference, or anything along those lines. You can try to negotiate with the seller, but understand that the seller is under no obligation to drop the price because of a low appraisal. That being the case, you can also accept the value and make up the difference. What does that mean, and what's an example of that? I'll show you on the next slide. But the fourth option is the buyer can back out. There is a contingency in the contract, in the RPA, that does say that if the appraised value comes in lower than the agreed upon price, that the buyer is able to back out of the transaction and not lose their initial deposit. So those are really the four things that you can do if an appraisal comes in low. Personal recommendation, start with contesting it. I would go in exactly the order that we had written it down here. So making up the difference, what's an example of that? So let's say you guys agreed on the purchase contract that the purchase price is going to be $500,000. The buyer is going to be coming in with a down payment of 20% or $100,000. Which means that the lender will make up the rest of it of 80%, or $400,000. Let's say that appraisal comes in at $480,000, which is $20,000 less than what you agreed upon. That lender will only lend 80% of that appraised value, which will be $384,000. So what that means is that's a new down payment of $116,000 if you are to keep that purchase price the same, which is that third option on the last slide, which was, again, making up the difference by increasing your down payment. So again, if the appraisal comes in low, one of the options you can do is make up that difference in the down payment. Definitely not the most desirable option if you are a buyer, but if they want the house bad enough, it has happened. I wouldn't say it's unusual, but it's not always the most common. Generally, what will happen is the buyer and seller will come to some sort of an arrangement or an agreement between the two, or, that is an option why properties do fall out of escrow. So that really covers the appraisal. We can open up a whole can of worms with appraisal, but let's get to loan approval. So loan approval can get a little bit tricky because there is a difference between loan approval and then there are pre-funding conditions, pre-doc conditions, and all of this. But in the purpose of what we're going to talk about in this video is loan approval when it comes down to needing to remove your contingencies. Now, generally this is a feeling of certainty on the lender's standpoint, and the lender will say, yes, you guys are good to remove your contingencies, we just need some final conditions met before we go to docs and all of that. What really all I'm going to talk about in this video is I like to ask the lender, is there any reason at all why this loan would not go through all the way to funding? Because if I get a sense of concern from the lender, I will advise the buyer not to remove that contingency, even if the time frame is up, because I would much rather have a client lose a house than they would lose their initial deposit, because that is never fun to remove their contingencies prior to that being the case. That, since we're covering removal of contingencies, let's talk about that. Removing of the contingencies is really putting it all on the line. This is really where this is the big decision on, do we remove our contingencies, put our initial deposit in jeopardy? Because until they remove their contingencies, the buyers realistically can back out and get all of their initial deposit back and go off and find another house. But as soon as they remove contingencies, things change a little bit. Just so you know, in California, we have what's called an active contingency removal system as opposed to a passive contingency removal system. By default in the contract, it states that they have certain time periods to remove certain contingencies. The big three that we like to talk about is the inspection contingency, which is by default 17 days, the appraisal contingency, again default 17 days, and the loan contingency, which by default is 21 days. In a passive removal of contingencies, that would be on day 18, the inspection contingency and appraisal contingency automatically would vanish. And on day 22, the loan contingency would automatically vanish. In an active removal of contingency, those contingencies remain in effect until the buyers formally remove them in writing with a form. Now I have here is the actual form that is used. It's called a contingency removal form. Now, this is the form that the clients have to sign to actually physically remove the contingency itself. Until they actually see this form and sign this form, those contingencies remain in effect. Now let's talk about what is the concern and the big deal with removing of contingencies. Let's first start on an RPA, or the offer, or the residential purchase agreement level. According to paragraph 14, if the buyer removes in writing any contingency or cancellation right, unless otherwise specified in writing, the buyer shall conclusively be deemed to have, number one, completed all buyer investigations and review of reports and other applicable information and disclosures pertaining to that contingency. Number two, elected to proceed with this transaction. And the big one, number three, is assumed all liability, responsibility, and expense for repairs or corrections pertaining to that contingency or cancellation right, or the ability to obtain financing. So what this says is when they remove that contingency, they are saying that they are taking 100% liability and expense for anything under that contingency, meaning any repairs, any appraisal value, any loan contingency. If, let's say, they remove their loan contingency and then the lender calls them up 30 seconds later and says, oh, we just found out something, we can't do the loan, that means that they are on the hook, because they have stated in writing that they have gone through all of their concerns, they're good, they're removing their contingency. That's why it's such a big deal when they do remove contingencies, because contractually this is when their deposit is on the line, which talks about the next part, which is actually from the bottom of the contingency removal form itself. And what that states is once all contingencies are removed, whether or not buyer has satisfied him or herself regarding all contingencies or received any information relating to those, buyer may not be entitled to a return of buyer's deposit if buyer does not close escrow. This could happen even if, for example, buyer does not approve of some aspect of the property or lender does not approve the buyer's loan. Now, don't get too afraid, because we all have to deal with contingency removals. Make sure your client understands we all have to deal with contingency removals. It's just one step in the process of purchasing a home. Now, because of that, I would not recommend removing contingencies unless the buyer is 100% certain that the condition is up to their their level, unless the appraisal is actually in, as opposed to a verbal, hey, the appraisal is coming in and it's going to be at value. Do not remove contingencies unless you see it in writing, you have it in front of you, so that it's actually something that you can hold on to. The loan approval, that's always the scariest, because there can always be something out of left field. That's why I really stress to the lender, is there any possibility of this loan not going through, or if you want to take it a step further, can I hold you to that? Can I hold you to making sure that this is going on? Because if they lose their deposit, are you guys going to refund it? That will usually get a lender to tell you more of the truth than when they just say, oh, that's fine, yeah, go for it. So again, contingencies, a big deal to remove, but it's just a part of the process that is necessary. I hope this video was helpful. I hope it didn't scare you off too much when it comes to contingencies, because that is just part of the business. We have to move forward. Just make sure that you have crossed all your T's, dotted all your I's, you keep your side of the street clean, you inform your client of how big of a deal contingencies are, because that is what keeps their initial deposits safe. So I hope that was helpful, and if you're ready for part 5, which is the final video in this series, click down below, and that's closing escrow and preventing those final hiccups. So thanks a lot for taking the time to watch this video. I know this was a little bit of a longer one, but there was a lot of content. I hope you got a lot of benefit out of it. If you have questions, leave them down in the comments down below. If not, go ahead and click on that orange button, and I'll see you at the next video.